In building forums that are successful, one of the key components is having what we call a safe environment. And while there are many components to a safe environment, the most important one and the backbone of forum is confidentiality. And the rule of thumb for confidentiality is that everything that's said in the room stays in the room. Another way to say it is nothing, no one, never. And exactly what that means is that nothing that we say here will leave here or will be said to anyone ever. Now that sounds like a tall task, and of course there may be some minor exceptions which we'll address later in the training. But for now, the rule of thumb is quite simply nothing, no one, never. The first piece of confidentiality that we have to be aware of is that we say nothing even to our spouses. We call that rule no pillow talk. Now that doesn't mean you can't talk to your pillow. You can talk to your pillow all you want to. But it does mean you can't say anything to your spouse, regardless of how close you may be to your spouse, regardless of how much you do share with your spouse on everything else that happens in your life. So even if we go home and your spouse says, "Hey, what happened at forum?" Well, the answer is it's confidential and we don't talk about it. What if you're asked who presented and you say, "Oh, well, this guy Joe presented." Well, then someone else who's in your forum goes home and is asked the same question. And instead of saying Joe presented, perhaps that person says, "Oh, I'm not going to tell you who it is, but listen to this story, because it's a really good one." Well, if that happens, you could imagine that if the two spouses were to meet, and if they were to compare stories, 1 + 1 = 5, and things get blown out of proportion, and we get the member in very big trouble. So in forum, we say nothing to anyone, not spouses, not anyone else. The next rule of forum that's critical is what we call walls have ears. And as you could imagine, if two members of the forum, or several members of the forum, are outside the meeting and they're talking about somebody, perhaps another member of the group who doesn't happen to be there, these members can be overheard. And if they're overheard, we can get that member in very big trouble. So ideally, in a perfect situation, we don't talk about any member of the group unless the member is present. Because if we do so, we risk the person's confidentiality. The next rule is no insider trading. And the bigger rule here is we're not above the law. So if you're subpoenaed by a judge and you say to that judge, "Well, that's forum confidential, I can't tell you," chances are the judge will simply laugh and say, "Under whose jurisdiction is that confidential?" So we have to be very careful with what we share in forum, and we can't assume that confidentiality is above the law. Next is what we call no dissension. If I have a problem with a member of the forum, the thing to do is to go directly to the member of that forum and to no one else. If I go to someone else, then we start to build mistrust. The person may wonder, well, does Mo talk about me when I'm not there? And what we want in forum is to build a very cohesive, tight-knit group. We want a cohesive, tight-knit group where there's absolutely no question that in that group we deal directly with each other in an upstanding way. If I have a problem with somebody, I go directly to that person. Next thing we have to be careful of is email. If I send an email to 10 members of my forum, in doing so, that email resides on at least 10 servers. Somebody's confidentiality is at risk. And as a forum, it's just important to talk about it and be aware of those risks, because without that awareness, we could get into big trouble yet again. I've seen people who say, "Hey, my emails are read by my assistant, and he prints them for me, and then I tell him what to type. And it goes back into the system, and I don't even have a computer on my desk." And that's fine, but if that's how you operate, it's important that your forum members know that, because they may choose not to share anything in that email knowing that your assistant will read it. On other occasions, I come across somebody who says, "Oh, my email goes to my whole family. My kids read it, my spouse reads it." And again, we have to be very careful. We have to be upfront with the forum in order to avoid accidental breaches. What about discussions outside of forum meetings? So, if we're outside of a forum meeting and I talk to a member of my group, is that discussion confidential? Well, some forums assume it's always confidential. Other forums say it's not in forum, so it's not confidential. And some forums say, well, if it is confidential, it must be declared as confidential. And I think that's a wise choice. because it allows the person to say we can have normal conversations, we could talk about football, we could talk about the weather, and we don't have to wonder. But if you're going to talk about something that is serious, more meaningful, and confidential in nature, then by all means, I need to know about that, and I need to know that it's confidential, and I don't have to wonder. We merely have to declare this form confidential, and I won't share it with anybody else. Now, what about other accidents? Like a member comes to forum and says to the forum, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm moving to another city." Well, do we assume that's public information? It sounds innocent enough. The right thing to do is to ask the person, is that information confidential? And the person might say, well, my employees don't know because I'm selling my business. But when you see my wife tonight, you're welcome to discuss it with her. But if we mention it to anyone else, we might very much have the deal go sour, and that's the last thing we want to do. If somebody violates confidentiality, and an example comes to mind years ago, we had a member go to his forum and say to the group, "I have great news. My wife is finally pregnant. We've been challenged with this issue for years, and as you know, we've had several miscarriages. But this time, we think it's going to work, and I want all of you to be the first to know." That night, one of the members in this forum goes to this person's wife and says, "Congratulations, I'm so happy for you." He sees the look of shock on her face and realizes, uh-oh, I just made a big mistake. What he did in this case was he went to the member and he apologized. He went to the forum and he apologized. After much discussion, the forum decided unanimously to keep the person in the group. This was based on the litmus test that each member of the forum can trust this person going forward. And handling it this carefully allows us to be sure that we have a safe environment. Without that safe environment, we can absolutely jeopardize the quality of the forum experience. So, confidentiality is rule number one. Confidentiality is the backbone of forum, and certainly there are many, many more nuances